Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here in this event that is part of a series of events, pre-conference of the Development Ethics Conference that we are going to carry out in Medellin next year. This series of events that we have carried out have the purpose of framing debates about the concept of development, but specifically about what these different visions entail about development in context of peace building. It has been really important in the planning of the conference of development ethics, both from the IDEA Institute and our partners from the Bioethics Network and from the UNAULA to think of how in an event we can talk about academic visions, but also visions from the social movements and organizations of all those people who are involved in processes of transformation of the territories associated to different ideas that we have about development. The encounter that we are going to have today is very special, both for those who are abroad and for those who are in Medellin. For people who are abroad, it's the possibility to understand a little bit how a city such as Medellin, a city which is relatively small, there are so many visions, so different visions about development, how a city that has gone through a lot of violence, very complex moments of the internal conflict in Colombia, also has developed initiatives of peace building with the participation of civil society and NGOs and communities. For who are abroad, this space is also the possibility to understand how all this coexistence, all that mixture of different visions about development make Medellin a city which is complex, but also a city with a lot of possibilities to develop alternative processes which are interesting in terms of development, always in relation with development ethics and peace building. But also a third important element for our dear colleagues who are abroad Colombia, our partners of IDEA, but also all the organizations that have been interested in this development ethics conference is to understand how these different expressions are maintained. Also how illegality and criminality coexist in these dynamics. In order to talk, something very important for all those who are in the city, for who are in Colombia, this space is also the possibility to talk about, again, about many topics that we have discussed in many academic, social, political scenarios, and that always generate questions about the complexity of this coexistence of different development visions, but also of those different processes that are born in the horizon of peace building. So we have many expectations with this encounter, and thank you all who join us today and who cannot do it directly, that through social media could see later this event and participate in this network of debates that we are doing before our development ethics conference that will be held in Medellin next year. In order to talk about these critical visions about development in the city of Medellin, we have invited three wonderful persons, two women who work in the academia. They are very committed with the processes of social building. Our dear Oscar Manuel, a man who is very committed with community and social processes. And I also have to say that these are three persons with whom I have a vital bond, which always makes me very proud and happy. We have invited, as the moderator of this panel, to our dear Professor Juan Camilo Arias, Director of the Line of Development and Neoliberalism in the Master's degree in Education and Human Development, who will be moderating this panel. I would like to introduce briefly our discussants today, and I will tell you that it is very important if questions arise, please share them in the chat so that we can respond to these questions later. I would like to start by introducing Sonia Valle. Sonia is a feminist. We have seen growing in her political proposal. She's a social worker. She studied our master's degree in education and human rights with a very nice work about social participation, about local planning and participatory budget, a project that she and her partner built to leave the city a qualified strategy that has worked during over a long time in the city. She currently is the coordinator of gender equity centers of the Women's Secretariat in Medellin. And Sonia's participation is very important because of that overview of the administration and the local government that provides us with a perspective of development processes. Thank you, Sonia. We, Yuri Montoya Cardona also joins us. She is a professional in Spanish language. She has worked about the memory peace building. She works in the museum House of Memory in the area of construction of social links. She has a very nice work that we shared about subjectivities and peace building. That proposal has motivated reflections of the processes in the city. And for Medellin, the Museum House of Memory is a place where many of those proposals converge, alternative proposals to build the city. So that's why Judy's participation is so important today. And in the panel is also Oscar Manuel Cárdenas. I had the pleasure to meet him through community work. Oscar is a magister in information science with a minor in memory and society. He's a researcher at university. He participates in Roots. That's part. He's part of the process of memory of the district, northeastern district in Medellin. He has done a great work with the memory topic, but he also has something that always wonders us, and is that he reads the territories in order to think about development alternatives. Oscar, thank you for being here with us. And we also have Juan Camilo Arias. As I told you, he is a professor of the master's degree in education and human rights. He's a candidate of PhD in sciences and humanities at National University. He has a very interesting work in reflecting the neoliberalism and how that system has transformed development and practices of development in Latin America. So he's a great person to moderate this space. Thank you for joining us today. And now with Camilo, this space will continue. Thank you all. Thank you, Alexa. Hello to all our participants and all the persons who will be joining in this dialogue. I will be moderating the conversation, but I invite you to have a very friendly encounter that from our words we can try to understand the complexity, not only what is entailed by a city that has acquired the dynamics of Medellin. It is a complex city, but it is a city of contrasts. It's a city where we could not see the processes in black and white. There are many processes that coexist between the conflict and peace initiatives in a city that goes to innovation, but at the same time shows levels of injustice which are very high. And also this complexity we can see in the different opinions about development and what the tensions imply between these different ways of conceiving it. We would like to start this reflection with a dialogue by inviting you to think about a topic that for us has been important from your visions, which are visions that come from different sectors, from the academia to institutions and regions. It would be important for us to invite you to reflect in this first part about what has entailed for the city of Medellin to think development and to implement policies in that direction over the last decades. We would like for you, from your perspective and experience, talk to us about what the impact has been for the city or the implications for a city of the nature of Medellin, to think and walk in terms of development. So uh, who wants to start? So Sonia, Yuri, Oscar, who wants to open this first round of discussion?
Bueno, si quieren arranco yo, que no.
Okay, if you want, I can start.
Y bueno,
That's
empecemos
Yuri.
como dándole a la conversación. Bueno, yo primero quiero agradecer esta
Well, first,
invitación.
I
Me
want
siento
to
pues muy
thank
afortunada de estar
that you
compartiendo
have
esta
invited
conversación
me
con las personas
and to share this
en este momento.
conversation
Y quisiera
with
como
you.
comenzar diciendo que esta ciudad,
I would like to
la
start by
expansión de la
saying
ciudad de
that the
Medellín,
expansion of the
creo
city
que
of
es muy
Medellin,
importante
I
prestar
think it's
atención,
very
sobre todo por
important
allá en los
to
años 70,
consider that in
cuando hay
the
como un
70s,
proceso de
where
desplazamiento
there
masivo de
was a process of
desplazamiento de
massive
diferentes tipos de
displacement
poblaciones
of different types
a,
of
tanto a
populations
nivel
at a
nacional,
national level and also regional
población
level.
indígena, campesina y
Afro-descendants,
demás que
people from
empiezan a
the
poblar
country
paulatinamente
that
esta
start
ciudad,
to
pero al mismo
populate
tiempo
this city, but
empieza
at
a
the
existir
same
allí un
time,
desorden muy grande
uh,
porque esta
some
ciudad desde que
disorders
era
that
pensada como una ciudad
started
industrial, una
because
ciudad que
a city
tanto
that
alto
was
progreso, una
thought
ciudad que
as an
prometía
industrial
trabajo y demás,
city
se
that
empieza a desordenar. Y
starts
eso
to
desde
get
luego que es muy
disorganized,
importante empezarlo a tener
and
en
that
cuenta
disorganization is
porque
important
a
to
la
be
medida de que la
considered
ciudad de Medellín empieza a poblar,
because when
empiezan a aparecer
Medellin
unas
started to be
problemáticas que
populated,
quizás en
some
esas
issues
administraciones, en
started
ese
to
momento
arise
histórico, no
that
estaban
maybe
tenidas
at
en
that
cuenta.
historical
Medellín
moment were
tiene
not
como esta
considered.
forma de casita,
Medellin has
digamos,
form,
bajo la
the
Ley de
shape of
Ordenamiento
a cup.
Territorial, la ciudad tenía
In
como
the
esa idea, y esto
territorial
muy popular
plan,
por
the
allá,
city
muy lejana también, de que el
was
centro de
conceived
la ciudad
as
pues
that
estuviera
the center
ordenado
of the
y alrededor
city
pues como
needed
caminos
to be
peacebuilding.
organized,
Yo creo
and
que para uno
and
comprender
the
esto basta con mirar
neighborhoods
el barrio Laureles, por ejemplo, el barrio Prado,
would
para
be
poder entenderlo. Pero eso no sucedió así
the
y no ha
neighborhoods
sucedido
be
así siempre.
around the
La
center,
ciudad
and
empieza a
that is
poblarse
not
en
like
las
that. The
montañas,
city
a lo que
starts
nosotros
to
llamamos
be populated
periferia,
in the
y se empiezan a
mountains, in the
configurar unos
suburbs,
barrios
and
en
some
los barrios hay
neighborhoods
una
neighborhoods start to be formed, and these neighborhoods born from communities. These communities started to gather and they started to think how the public services would be. And when you have walked around the neighborhoods in this city, you can notice the difference that there are from the center to the periphery, the suburbs. And then you can identify that social distance, that economic distance that starts to appear in the city. I mentioned this because there is a decade with a very noticeable rupture. I think that would be a subject for one day, one whole day. I will not stop. I will not develop a lot about this topic.
Y no tan positivas. Entonces
Which is
empieza a
not so positive. So we start seeing illegal practices. The figure of Pablo Escobar, who has a lot to do with the ordering outside of the state that take place in neighborhoods in Medellin. So many authors have talked about it. They've talked about the lost generation time, different movies that show that young people in Medellin didn't have a future. They didn't think about the future. And I think this makes it clear that young people didn't think they could get older, they could have a project in life, but everything was immediate, of easy and fast money, of buying things for their mothers, but they didn't have a future. And and the the degradation of the problem has to do with our present as well. But I want to stop to talk about a very interesting topic that I've been thinking about lately, and is the mega projects of the social interest works. I don't know if you've had the chance to read about it, No Occidente, different projects in the cities, mega projects that were taking place in the city. That was a national policy where the government was looking for delivering 100,000 houses for victims of forced displacement, people who had suffered from natural disasters and had to migrate, and people, it's a difficult name for me to say, but it's extreme poverty, people in extreme poverty. So those three types of population were coming to these mega projects, but those are buildings, around 80 buildings in a very in a place that is far from the city center, and it's very different population, indigenous people, people from Medellin, farmers, Afro-Colombians, and they come to these buildings. And there are so many questions in terms of development. We could say that these houses are delivered for free, but for example, a farmer is a real example that I heard recently, and they're giving the house on the fifth floor. They, it's a building that doesn't have an elevator, and the farmer was frustrated because the horse couldn't go upstairs. And something that small, but very significant, because when thinking about the context of a territory, and it's not about just giving them houses, but thinking about what type of people are going to be living in there, what organizations are going to be close to them, accompanying them in this process, in this change of new thinking, of vertical living, for example, and many other issues that come up. That's just an example. But not so long ago, I was in one of those mega projects with an organization, and they were telling us that when they got there was not a health center nearby, no entertainment or recreation spaces, which are very important for a community. The the schools were collapsing. The only school that was nearby was collapsing because of the amount of people that arrived to that area. So not every kid was able to access school, which obviously created many problems. And just to wrap up, I'll say that I'll tell you about something that was interesting for me as well, what that has to do with that action, that rush when we want to do good things, but we make mistakes in the process. And in Villas de Santa Fe, in one of those projects in the middle of those units, there's an office. There's a swimming pool, I'm sorry, to, and it was thought as a recreational space. But when the people who live in the territory are told that if they want to use the swimming pool, they have to buy different materials, the swimming suit and everything else, is it tells us a lot about the context. If they're talking about people in extreme poverty, people who have their rights violated and have a lot of economic inconvenience, how will they be able to buy a swimsuit? So those are the things that we need to keep in mind when we have some of those mega projects. So the word dignity starts having very complicated nuances when we think about these mega projects. I want to leave this conversation with this comment because I know we've talked about violence in Medellin, the youth in Medellin, and the deterioration that the conflicts in this city have had. We've had all the armed actors, these actors, this city has had to be rethought towards peace. But I wanted to tell you about this story because lately I've been getting closer to this mega project in terms of development. I think this could be an interesting discussion and think how we can really contribute to a society that has suffered quite a lot. So sometimes we think we're doing the right thing, but actually we're creating even more problems inside the community. Thank you, Yuri. I think we touched on very important aspects in your intervention about the complexity of the term development. And I think you bring up another component that we need to think about. It's not just, well, there are different ways of thinking about development through public policies and theoretical aspects and the concepts of what it is. But besides, there are different social actors that we need to bear in mind, and the tensions in the territories give us information of different ways of thinking about the territory, and we can see the tension that rises between the population, specific populations, and the state. Are they understanding the same thing with the word development? I think it's a very important debate in this discussion, and is, can we think about development that is homogeneous? Can we have just one vision of development that can be implemented with one goal that we can foresee in every place? So your intervention gives us an introduction of very important questions regarding the importance of different ways according to different contexts and location, and how we think about development in those terms. It's not just about the theoretical part, but thinking about the actors who are living in those territories that are touched by development. So thank you, Yuri. I think you touched on very interesting topics for our discussion. And now the floor is I'll give the floor to Oscar or Sonia if you want to add anything else related to what Yuri mentioned. We have Oscar, and after that we'll talk with Sonia. You can start, Sonia, and then we'll listen to Oscar. All right. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can. So Yuri gives us a very interesting topics on the table regarding how the city was built, was made. And it's interesting for us to understand how we're thinking about Medellin in terms of development and planning, also in terms of ordering and how we understand the city nowadays, ordering a city specifically for some kinds of, for specific populations. And on the other hand, those others are in the outskirts, in isolated places in the city, and they have very specific ways of understanding development and in how they built their territory, which we're starting to talk about more in the city, not only from the discourse, but direct action in the territories. I wanted to, around this question that you asked, which is a very generic question, but I think it's important, because in Medellin, we've had different ways of understanding development, and different ways of understanding how the city is distributed in ordered. And when we go to the literature from the 20th century, the beginnings of the 20th century, we had the first migrants in our city. They were families and people arriving from different regions of the department and different regions in the country, in a city that was growing, a city that had a very specific idea of where to go, different from other cities in the country, and an organization that was very industrial centered. That's the way the city was thought. And we had a territory that had to be occupied and we had to take advantage of. And in the 20th century, I think was fundamental because it gives us the discussion and gives us many ideas of what kind of city we want to build. And Judy was talking about different neighborhoods like Laureles, which had new planning ways. They have different structures in a very French way of conceiving urbanism. But also we have something else that happens in Medellin, which is almost cutting the city, dividing the city in two. We have a river, yes, but there was a line through this river, and we recovered different areas, different natural areas close to the river. And being able to plan around it was very important for the city in terms of thinking if we wanted to have a centrified city and that was going to keep growing, but in our own terms. Yuri also talked about something else, and I'm going to mention your comments a lot because I think they're very important. And I call them very important moments in the city because forced migration in Colombia that didn't happen in just in the 90s or the 80s, but happened since the 60s after the violence in the countryside, made it possible for those families who arrived massively and also slowly to the country, they started to have an influence in the country. And at first, that was taking place in the center of the city and slowly went to the outskirts. And that forced the city that years later, maybe until 1993, there were 14 expansions of the area of the city, which is a lot. So yeah, the city was expanding, but it was happening because more people were arriving to the city, to Medellin and other cities in the country, people from the countryside who didn't want to be there in the first place. But what happened was there was an armed conflict that forced them to go to the cities in very difficult conditions. They hadn't planned, they didn't plan to migrate to the cities. So that way of arriving was a contrast with the ways in which the city was being planned and ordered. And I was reading a press article of, of 1974, and they were talking about a green line. They said they said they wanted to generate in the outskirts of the city, in the borders of the city, which didn't have so many neighborhoods at that time. We want to have a space for food distribution for the city. We want to do this, it said, and we want to do it with the families who are already there, especially farmers who were occupying those territories that didn't even belong to the municipality. We had different private territories of very specific families who to this day still own many of those territories. So we had these families, and the municipality at the time said, we want to have some food crops, so we don't have to bring food from other places, but the city will have all the supplies. This obviously stopped after the massive arrival of people, and this made it possible, or this generated some strategies towards that new population that was coming in. And we hear many stories in the neighborhoods here in Medellin. And to give you a context, there were some contests about stories in the neighborhood in the 80s and in the 90s. And when we open these stories, like it's like opening the Pandora's box, we see the handwritten stories or in a writing machine, but what matters is what those stories said. And most of them said that they arrived, they took those pieces of land at the time. They talk about different neighborhoods in the lower part of the second districts of Medellin, in the upper part in Aranjuez. And then police force would arrive with their horses and they would destroy our little houses, and then we would do it again. We would take the territory and build our house until one of the parties would get bored of it. And that's kind of the dynamics in which many neighborhoods were built. And there's something that happens which is fundamental, and is what made people stay in the city. Why didn't they go back to their territories? And that question is quote unquote easy to answer, and has to do with the national context. There was no way to go back because of the conflict, because they took the land from those people, or there were no safe conditions to go back, or because in that place we had some appropriation and collective action dynamics that would allow those people to stay in those territories, in their communities. And I think later we'll talk about the other dynamics that enhance the social bonds and the social tissue in the territory. But besides that, there's another key aspect, which is when we have this capitalist model in the 90s to the city, to think about the city. So we have a new strategy of or territorial organization that reaches the local aspect and starts to have a conversation with other contexts. And at a territorial level, what we have as communities, as neighborhoods, the essence of those places makes it possible to think about the city, and it creates different strategies around the planning of the territory and the neighborhood. And I have an internal fight. I think many of us have that of between the idea of what's formal and informal, what we can plan and what we can't, and how what is planned becomes more important than what wasn't planned. So this discussion started at that time in the 90s and through different territorial planning. In this openness of this liberal city, in the city seen as something that can be sold as a aesthetic and globalized city, creates different ideas when we talk about different processes in the territory. I think I'll just stop right there. Yes, I think you talk about many interesting aspects that give continuity to our reflection that, that Judy started, especially the tensions between public policies of territorial ordering on all the realities in the territories give us an interesting context to and understand how the dynamics and the conflicts can be associated to it. And what you mentioned of the difficult coincidence between the formal and informal city, between the planned and the non-planned city, what wasn't expected in terms of complex social relations in this
The
city
city
that
that
has been
has been
partially
partially
ordered
projected,
and planned,
but
but that also
has
has
been
been self-managed,
self-managed.
and I think is
And it's
important.
important to insist on this term because on the one side we find the city that the administration plans, but also the city that is being built in the territories and the communities to defend these territories. So it's an element which is very important. From now on, I will uh, so that we can have some questions that will arise. I will try to compile them and invite you to try to describe the places, the areas where we are. We don't have now visual aids, but we fortunately have your experience, your vision. So please describe with your words that Medellin that is alive, that Medellin that you have lived in and where you have found this complex knitting of development. So we will have Sonia next to close this first round of presentations, but it's very important after the words of Oscar and Yuri, we want to understand and listen to your vision. Good morning. Thank you to the university and all the people who are joining us in this conversation. The good thing of doing my presentation after these two ones are that is that there are like threads that can connect this discussion about the critical visions of development in Medellin. I want to talk about some elements that have been already mentioned and to look for common points. I will start by saying that around development, there are two elements that are very important, both for institutions and the community and the academia and the entrepreneurs in a city like Medellin, which is the second Colombia's most important city after Bogota, which is the capital. Those elements are planning and participation. Those are two things that are directly linked to the development of a city such as Medellin. The first thing is to say that around planning, this city is rich in planning processes. You could say that it even has an excess of planning processes that have stayed there, that have stayed in the creation of a technical phase, but have not been able to pass to a second or third phase of implementation or funding around this planning. This is a city that plans, that makes plans. Uh, in the last decades, since the year 2000, my colleagues said this city since the 90s or maybe before. I lost the sound. I'm sorry. Sound is lost. Has thought about development processes, has made plans, the places where it will construct industries and neighborhoods. We have 16 urban districts. I lost the sound. 16 urban districts. We have a river that goes through the city that makes it divides it into the north city and the south city and the eastern city and the western city. And we have small territories which are almost invisible, even if efforts have been made to make them visible, to name them in that map that maybe you can see in that map. We can see that these small areas are seen. Almost no map shows a city which has 16 districts and 5 townships. This is a city where planning processes have been carried out since the 19th. The community planning processes was very important at that time. The first districts that started with planning were the northeastern and northwestern districts and District 13. Those neighborhoods who have been characterized as the outskirts. And from that time, there were area plans with a wide vision to integrate territories. And therefore, in this city, there is a debate or a confusion about the administrative political division because we talk about the northeastern district. But that northeastern area, eh, it's composed of 4 districts: number 1, number 2, number 3, Manrique, and number 4, Aranjuez. From the 90s, they already had an area planning process that implied to think about that northeastern part of the city. At the community level, this city has had significant participation and planning processes. In order to contextualize in terms of institutions, the city is ruled by a democratic system, as every city in Colombia. It has a 4-year government. Every 4 years, we change governments. And in those government changes, since the year 2001 on, this city, the development plans developed by the administrations that have been in this process have instituted some names that give the logic of development and that build some imaginaries. This is a city that has been named as a competitive city, a sustainable city, an innovative city, a cultural city, a city that has all those conditions, but that actually it's a process that has been not linked to community planning. So there are development plans that every 4 years they institute a speech around what Medellin is expected to become. Of course, there has been progress, there have been interventions, there have been mega projects. We have a transport system which has evolved, but in effect, those development features are not linked with community planning processes that have been named as equitable territories that respect human rights. For instance, the District 3 has a development plan with an approach to human rights, and also District 4 had the same at the beginning. And they have been thinking the territories in a very different way. So every 4 years, the administration and the institutions build a speech that makes you think that this city is progressively improving, but this is not real or concrete for the citizens in Medellin. The business people has had periods of talking with institutions and with community, and they are making efforts and putting financial resources into different territories or topics, but they have also not been able to read the institutional conditions or of the public proposals and the interests of the community and not of citizens. So these are three visions that have been present in Medellin and that have been developed, but that have not had the possibility to interact or to find agreement so that it would be a development proposal very robust, would allow the three sectors to put their efforts and make them concrete projects in a mid and long term. It's important to understand that we have a lot of planning and participation processes, but that there is, I don't know if it would be good to say that there is a coexistence, because what I feel is that there are three different scenarios that don't don't manage to interact. In 2004 or to 2008, there have been efforts or attempts to interact with all those stakeholders try to do it, but I don't see a scenario like that one now. I am talking about that period because it is what I remember about a possible debate or the construction of the development vision in the citizen conferences. In those congresses, we had the institutions, the community, and the business people, and they tried to debate about different topics such as healthcare and education and economy, but nothing was done, and spaces like that did not happen again. Now the universities, communities, business people have developed their own proposals and have, but there is no scenario today that compiles those proposals into a single one. I think I agree with the proposals of my colleagues, but this city has been built in a centralist way, logical. We are 16 districts and 5 townships. For instance, any township, the names are San Sebastián de Palmitas, which is the most rural one, Altavista, San Cristobal, San Antonio de Prado, and Santa Elena. Any of those townships, the people living there, or even public servants who go there to visit, they say, go to Medellin. I am going to Medellin, or I'm going now because getting to Medellin takes time, as if they were not in Medellin. So the vision of development is very central and is not linked with rural logics. So there is a big distance between the visions of youth, children. We are talking about a very centralistic thinkings of development. I remember that in a debate about the representation of the different sectors that participate in the city, where the, in every area there is a sector of children and women and of seniors, a sports area, recreation. I mean, the organization and participation becomes divided. I remember the debate in district where a representative of the community that we know as local administrative boards, which are organizations that are very well recognized in the territories. They say, here we don't have gay people. Here we don't need to call for representatives of gay people because we have no gay people in a district that has hundreds of inhabitants. So that's the inability to think about development and the representation and participation and planning. We need to think about that. There are many planning processes. Uh, Oscar also mentioned the territorial plan. That process is very good, very technical one, but no one knows it. It's really difficult for institutions to embrace it, to think their investment processes. So we plan a lot. We have a lot of participation processes, but that has not been articulated. And there is no scenario today where all those visions join to think development. I just wanted to mention, because there is a question related with public policies and what with I'm telling you that we are in a city where 16 districts exist with diverse populations. Today, we are before a scenario where there are many public policies. We all have public policies. That's a saying that has been known in the institutionals. It's like there is a public policy for everyone, for women, for young people, for Afro descendants, for seniors. But in effect, every group makes their proposals, but there are no articulating ears. And I would respectfully say that there is no scenario that manages to make those proposals interact that have been proposed from the participation processes and the formulation of public policies. Go on, Oscar. I would like to say something in relationship with the question about the youth public policies. Since the end of the 90s in Medellin, the, uh, they started to think about young people in Medellin, not before. So young people was started to be seen as that population that is key for the city and that were most affected by urban criminality. I think that this is very new in terms, not only in community terms, but also from the governments to think in a contextualized way about young people. Sonia talked about the townships, and it seemed that as in the townships, there are no young people. However,
First, there's no political will for this, for accompaniment and understanding new ways of living the city from the point of the youth. So we see a lot of many policies that fail, and I think we think to get closer to the young people, to the townships, and we need to see more external support that could make these ideas and projects possible. So I just wanted to make that comment of something that is very new related to the young people. Also, the public policy as a text is like the Constitution is very interesting, it's very nice, but within the idea of development and how it enables or it can be important, we have to take that paper to action. Obviously, talking about ethical ways of managing the city and that can reach all the populations in a fair way. Thank you, Oscar, for your comment. We talked about it internally when we have many questions that these conversations are coming up, and I'll try to gather some of those questions and then talk about it later on, because it's part of this conversation that 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 we're discussing today. Well, there are very important topics that touches everybody in our society, and what Oscar said is a proof of it, and how important young people are for planning and thinking about the future. And this is a historical and political importance that they have. And particularly in this topic, it is important to think about those distinct historical moments and talk about all the elements that could affect us today. And I link this with other elements that we've talked about, that Sonia talked about, which are very important, a very important reflection that you give us with those three visions of development of these three actors that you point out as fundamental, which is the state, the companies, and the community. And we have these three actors that not always get to have a conversation. And what has happened is that a vision of development has been imposed, and you talk about it, but you refer to it as a centralist vision. And I think we can relate it with a vision that tries to exclude all the dynamics and populations that live outside of that central vision. And, and through the context of crisis that Yuri talked about in her first intervention, talking about the 80s, through this, we have a new signification, a new meaning of development, in where the city starts being more liberal in, in all the region, and what that implies for Medellin to start to be conceived as an industrial city, or what tensions does it imply when we assume the city, when we think about the city as an industrial place. And that gives us many important questions to think about it, and to think that development is not necessarily a synonym of economic growth. Economic growth can be a component in what we're mentioning in the conversation, but the complexity of society pushes us to think about another perspective, a bigger perspective that takes into account the social aspects and the diversity, such as education and culture and other topics, instead of having a reductionist view of in economic terms. So I think there are very many interesting ways that we can think about it and talk about. And right now I have a question that I want to share with you that I think it's worth mentioning, in having the context of our country after many decades of armed conflict, and having tried to take another path of ending this conflict. So with this context, this very complex problem that you have talked about already, and what implies the difficulty of planning a city that is immersed in conflict dynamics, receiving migrants and also people who are migrating out of the city. Very, very complex dynamics that we have in the city that makes that whatever plan we have doesn't really work, that we have to rethink about this plan. In having this conflict in mind and what it's meant to try to end this armed conflict, I'd like to ask, what's your relation of the different visions of development with the peace building processes, memory and non-repetition and reconciliation? What do they have to say about development when we rethink and overcome this conflict? I don't know who'd like to, if anybody has a comment on it. Okay, Oscar. Okay, let's start with Yuri. Yeah, I like to start by mentioning something that Sonia said, which is the word coexistence, which is kind of difficult for me to understand, because when we talk about a relation, there should be a balance, and I don't see a balance. The social and victim organization have a lot to say to institutions, a lot to say to administration, and there's something that's real, and Sonia talked about it, which is that they're not listened to. Sometimes they gather in a debate, they expose they talk about their point of view, but at the end of the day, they're not truly listened to. So there are some aspects that survive to those talks, but some other impositions. So there's no coexistence, I feel, that has a real balance. And I'm very concerned about it, because there are many scenarios in which we can say what we think, And in the 80s, I don't think that was possible. Now we can raise our voices. We can talk about our points of view. And the Participation Secretariat, for example, has a database of over 3,000 social organizations only in the city of Medellin. So in terms of participation, gives a lot of information, but it turns out that this participation is not effective. This concept is completely changed because social leaders are tired of saying or talking about what they need in their territories, but but the government and the higher institutions haven't listened to them. And if we want to talk about peace building and non-repetition guarantees, we need to talk about these matters with a lot of respect. And it frustrates me a lot to see that there's no effective or active listening when thinking about the problems in our city. And on the other hand, I wanted to say that we're not a peace city, and I think we've given many comments of why that is, and we cannot be a peaceful city when we allow military operations in one of the districts, which is the 13th district. How can we allow that humanitarian international law had already had some guidelines of how to enter this territory, and the police force just did whatever they wanted entering this district, and something that happened in 2002 in October. I want to bring this to this context. There are around 200 people who are still missing after this military operation, and I think we need to keep talking about it and to focus on that as well. And there's an example of Ruben, who is, I don't remember his last name. The He works in the culture center, and he was a part of a report on the 13th district on the memory and the resistance of the territory, and he said something that made me think of, and he said we can talk about different reports, we can give all the literary sources, and we can talk about participation and quote unquote active listening to victims and organizations. But he gave an important reflection, which is that we cannot know the history of the city in its as a whole. Us as citizens of Medellin, we don't know what has happened in the 13th district, just to give you an example, because that happens in many other territories. So I don't really know what the conclusion is, how we can arrive to a solution that we can actually talk about peace building in the city of Medellin. And as Alexandra was mentioning, I've talked about the concept of memory. I worked in the Museum of Memory, and I feel like, why do we need memory when we talk about many social and participation problems of violence that we still see in many places in Medellin? Why talking about memory? What's the use for us people in Medellin to think about this concept? And I'm constantly thinking about it, because when we talk about memory, we think about peace building, and that's necessarily, they don't have a link necessarily. Memory has some specific aspects, ethical, political aspects, and peace building seem to be the goal. But memory is not just the way to getting to that goal. There's an example that I was given before, is how is it possible that Villas de Santa Fe was delivered in 2015, one of those mega projects. So what are we learning about the history of the city? It was easy to identify certain aspects of the territory, and the administration overlooked many of those aspects, such as not including a school, not including an entertainment place in the territory, knowing how important that is. So I don't really know how we can come up with a solution, but I do know that as the question when we talk about men in anthropology, which is unattainable, there's a question that we can ask, we have to ask ourselves about Medellin. We have to think about this city in terms of peace building, even if it sounds a bit romantic. We need to think about it when we have been living in very violent contexts. We have to keep thinking about how can we rethink the city, what proposals do we include, but we have to think about it from peace building. Thank you for your intervention, Yuri. I think you give us many elements to think about, and for sure we'll come back to many of them in these remaining minutes. I would emphasize on one of the ideas you mentioned, which is the need or the moment in which there's a fracture of communication between the concrete needs in the territories and the institutionality. Why aren't are why they haven't been listening to the territories, and how and why those are basic points to start rethinking about, thinking about the concrete needs that leaders express, and that would make participation something more effective and something that goes beyond formality, and that actually gives a possibility to take this to action, to concrete actions for communities in different territories in our city. And I think this is key when thinking about a peace agenda that really can be effective, and not just do all the formal aspect, but not going to actually overcome many difficulties in the territory. So thank you. Okay, I'll give the floor to Oscar. So, this is a very interesting conversation. I think we could do this. I could do this all day. I would say that there's no peace without um, a fair life, without dignity. And many people in the territories in Medellin don't have that. When displaced people arrived, especially in the 90s, they took uh, some some land in Medellin and generated new territories within already established neighborhoods. And they started to autonomously build their territory. They thought we need schools, we need water, we need electricity, and they all did it by themselves. And most of territorial work in that construction, in that construction of neighborhoods, uh, women from different regions, they had a very important role. And I think it's important mentioning, and we talk about it in the neighborhood La Onda. We said that women took everything and put them on their shoulders to start building the neighborhood. And there's something important related to the armed conflict, the internal armed conflict in the city, which we still feel to this day, obviously linked to the national conflict, which is that many of those military operations happen in the 13th district, but that has happened in other areas in the city, in the 3rd district, with different operations that we are just starting to see what the effects were. Back in 2003, it was 3 days of military operation. And this created new logics around how the city was reorganizing itself. In thinking about the conflict in this case, so we started talking about in intra-urban displacement. which also generated different transformations and conflicts in many of our territories, but also brought some benefits, quote unquote benefits, because of the when we started to get to know those problems in the territories. And what I want to say with this is that territories all in despite the lack of action of the state, we have generated peace processes within the communities. We have conversations with armed organizations where there was no presence of the state. They have they have made it possible to have peace processes at a territorial level because those were people who grew up together within a community. So they got together, they generated agreements of how to improve their coexistence. Because if they don't have those conversations, it will be very complicated. So we have to think about those internal processes that have taken place in the city that have allowed many other processes to happen within the territories. And, and somehow those young people who belong to armed groups are also part of the territory, they're part of the community, and that's also something we have to rethink. Something else I wanted to mention has to do with how people have been organizing themselves in order to have proposals of models of city models, urban models. At the beginning, there was a big debate of the right to the city. And I didn't come from here, but now I am from here, and I need to talk to the municipality, to the academia, to private companies of how we're going to build the city. Sometimes they didn't listen to us, and that's okay, but let's talk to the academia. So we've generated very important conversations, and I wanted to highlight this in between the academia and community organizations, grassroots organizations, around thinking of different ways of building the city. So many interesting things have happened in the 8th, in the 1st, and the 13th district when we think about social value, for example. And we have actually been in this territory for 20 or 30 years, and we are not formal neighborhoods, but it was very hard for us to bring the materials to to build the neighborhood. It was very hard work to build this neighborhood in this community, and that has a cost, and that should be respected in terms of ways of planning the city. But also let's take a look at the I just forgot. But besides the social valuing process, let's think about how the neighborhoods are planned and organized. If people come from a town, we need a piece of land. And why isn't there considered in the formal city and neighborhood planning? And then also we have to talk about risks. There are several, especially in specific neighborhoods in Ladera, in the outskirts. In that sense, we should look at the risks of how to administrate those neighborhoods from the plans, from the planning of the city. And we have to see how we can generate conversation with people in the communities who have different beliefs and different ideas that come from previous generations, and we have to think about it and take this conversation even to educational contexts like the academia and universities. And I think it is important to talk about technical knowledge of communities. We grew up in the ladera, in the outskirts of the city, and a lot of our experience, academic and technical experience, has to do with social processes that are grassroots. There are many professionals in that area, and so the conversation with the administration is is not at different levels, but we are on the same level that enhances, it makes it possible to have different and more balanced conversations between the administration and people in the communities. So we talk about the external and organizations who are supporting these processes of city. And now we have many proposals at a territorial and neighborhood level in of public policies to protect the people who live there, and how can we take this to action. So there are different proposals for this, and we have territorial peace schools and memory schools that make it possible to ask ourselves historically how this process has been in our territories, in how we have built memory around experiences and about neighborhood building, in all the references that we have or that are no longer in the territories, because many older people arrived to Medellin who were very, very important in their original territories, and they left a very important legacy. And many of us had the chance to know about it. And through that legacy that we've built and we keep building, are useful for territory and neighborhood building. So there are many important aspects, the community actors and the role of municipality and the state, the role of academia and public and private companies. So we have to see all of those actors and how they can really interact in a greater conversation to have a more dignity in our city, which is the base of human rights that sometimes we lack.
Oscar, you are talking about elements very valuable that would allow us to have a conversation for the whole afternoon, even longer. And that is the idea of this encounter. By having a conversation agenda uh, for the next encounters that we will have, I would highlight some elements. I would emphasize the difficult to have a city for peace when we have a city which is profoundly unequal. That social justice is a basic element for having a peace city and a city focused on peace. There is a tension that is proposed by neoliberalism, not only in Medellin's case, but up to what point we can have development as inequality and exclusion are present. Inequality is an issue that must be in the center of the question about development. And in relation to what you mentioned, the importance of not assuming communities as passive subjects. On the contrary, they are creating their territory. They are defending their territory. They are thinking about it. They are living it. And you touched one of the questions that we are not going to address, and it has to do with the organization mechanisms and mechanisms for defending territories of the communities that inhabit them. So, and the organization has played an important role on the production of this territory. that people have met to construct and build their houses and their roads and to have sewage and the access to public services that must be provided by the state, but in the context of state neglect. Communities need to organize themselves to build their own territory, and they have done that. And it's important for that forms of building the space have been listened to and been considered as a starting point when thinking about planning, which is more localized and relevant and efficient, where this formal dimension of development is translated into a real implementation for people who inhabit the territory. And that is fair and dignified because that's the base of a society in peace and to close these conflicts where exclusion has been the leitmotif. Those have been the engines of this complexity. Thank you, Oscar and Sonia. You have the floor. This is the last round of questions that we have to share with you. Okay, I'm going to try to be as short as possible, as brief as possible. We have received a lot of questions. I will summarize into three. The first one is that I insist that community has constructions and experiences that are very important around development and planning, but institutions and business people also have it, and also the academia. It is not because of a lack of proposals, but it is because of a lack of a scenario of agreement. When the professor mentioned what the mechanism is, I feel that what we are lacking is a construction scenario where we can agree on what is common and what we cannot do jointly. I'm referring to all those actors, the communities, institutions, companies, and the academia. This city has a lot of processes. They have described that. We have community processes, which are impressive in terms of what it means in the territorial constructions, in their experience, history. But I think it's necessary to recognize that community has built that, but that there are other scenarios where proposals have been developed about development. No, the audio is bad. I'm sorry. This is a long conversation.
También que a veces, digamos que estamos cayendo mucho en la trampa de la representación.
We are thinking a lot about representation.
Como lo terminaba en la intervención de la primera ronda, se están concentrando mucho
We are focusing on the specific proposals of specific population groups and the possibilities of having conversations about development are not very consolidated. They are fragmented. It's not possible to start to think with others because I am with people who have ideas similar to mine to build a proposal, but we are losing the possibility of having scenarios where the different stakeholders are with their different ways of thinking. So there is a clue that is it's necessary to have deliberation scenarios around the concept of city and around what we understand for, for sustainable city. In this city, an idea about good living and human development, what development
digamos,
means
de un contexto
today
como el que
in a
estamos viviendo,
context
que es el contexto de
like we are
pandemia, realmente no se ha
living,
discutido.
such as
Esto
the
no es algo
pandemic
que
has
es
not
una
been
discusión
discussed. That is
conocida
not a
desde el inicio de la
discussion
edad,
that
es
is
una discusión
well
que
known.
damos o dan
It's a
algunos
discussion
individuos en particular
by
porque tienen una
some collective
experiencia
groups
específica,
because
pero
they
no
have
es
a
una
specific
discusión
experience, but it
colectivo.
is
El
not a
colectivo, por
collective
ejemplo, que es un
discussion.
modelo
The good
que
living,
está,
which is a
que se supone
model
tan
and a
bonito y tan propia,
construction,
¿cierto? De los
so
diferentes
nice
comunidades
construction
con
by the
diferentes
different
desarrollos que se nos
communities with
dice
different
en algunos
development
países como
visions.
la ciudad de Medellín,
Visions is something that is
ciudad
not
innovadora,
discussed in
la
this
ciudad con
city.
proyectos
We talk
innovadores,
about the innovative,
digamos que
competitive
le apuestan
city,
como a
the
esa misma
city
a
that
desarrollar esa lógica. Bueno, lo otro y
has
con eso
this
respondería a tu
development
pregunta,
logic.
es que quiero
Um,
responder un poco cuando
I
mostraba
would
ese
like to
mapa.
respond
Ahí se
when
veían
we show
escenarios
the
como
map,
los parques biblioteca.
scenarios were shown,
En efecto,
like
desde
the
las
Parques
creo que
Biblioteca.
unas 4 administraciones
Some,
hacia atrás, recuerden
the
que las
sound is bad.
administraciones gubernamentales en esta
Governmental
ciudad son cada
institution in
4
this
años,
city
tienen 4 años
have
de periodo
4-year periods,
de implementación. Se han venido construyendo escenarios públicos, infraestructuras
scenarios,
públicas
public
aptas, digamos, para el encuentro ciudadano.
scenarios and
Medellín
infrastructures
es una
have
ciudad
been
rica
built
en parques
for
biblioteca, en unidades de vida articulada,
community
en
encounters. So we
comunidades
have
en
libraries
casas de la
and
cultura, en centros de
sports
desarrollo
center, culture
social.
houses,
Esta es una ciudad que tiene
social
varias sedes,
development
tiene
centers.
sedes
We have
sociales, no
some
todas, o sea, tiene
good
problemas también de sedes
campuses.
comunitarias en los barrios, muchos problemas de sedes comunitarias,
But we
pero
have
definitivamente por
community
ejemplo,
headquarters
de la
problems, but we
memoria,
also have the
existen
memory museum,
escenarios amplísimos
institution,
digamos,
education
para el encuentro.
institution
Entonces,
with
¿qué
good
pasa? Son escenarios muy
with good
institucionalizados,
facilities,
entonces la
but those
gente
are very
no los percibe como tal,
institutionalized
¿cierto? Entonces son
scenarios, and
escenarios
people
amplios,
don't
tienen
feel
auditorios,
that
tienen espacios amplios, pero
these
la
are
gente no
their
los
own
utiliza. Y,
scenarios,
la,
and
y
people
quienes
don't
los
use them.
utilizan, digamos que
And
no lo
those who
potencian,
use them
digámoslo así, o no han logrado tener esa
have not
potencia como escenarios
managed
de encuentro
to
ciudadano.
use
La
them
mayoría de los
as
administradores de
citizen
administración,
encounter
administraciones, la mayoría de
scenarios.
las empresas públicas de Medellín
The
o por el Instituto
public
de Deportes, por ejemplo,
utilities
o por,
company of
digamos, las
Medellin
organizaciones o entidades, digamos,
have
que hacen parte
contributed in the
de esta
construction
ciudad,
of some of them,
pero no son
and they
no
or they
logran ser
administer
escenarios
it,
para el encuentro
but these
ciudadano. ¿Por qué?
scenarios have not managed
Porque
to
para
be
tener una deliberación,
citizen
para tener un
scenarios,
debate, para tener un
because
encuentro,
in order
para
to
tener
have
esa
an
presencia
encounter and to
física, así
talk,
como nos estamos
we
viendo
need
hoy,
to see
o
each
como
other
nos
as
podemos
we
ver
are
a las
seeing
personas
each other
en
today.
todos,
But this
a las
conversation
personas
does
de los
not
barrios que
reach
viven
the
en esa
people
ciudad.
of the
Entonces,
neighborhoods.
entonces yo creo que es son escenarios que son públicos,
These
pero que
are
necesitan ser
public scenarios
potencializados
that
para
need
realmente ser encuentros ciudadanos. Yo pongo un
to
ejemplo.
become
Yo trabajo en
places
la Secretaría de las
for
Mujeres. El año
citizens to
pasado
meet. I work in the
tuvimos
Women's
el mes
Secretariat.
pasado
Last
una
month,
sesión
we
de
had the
conversación con
intention of
líderes de
having a
comunidades
conversation
corresponsables
about
masculinas. Hicimos un proceso
nonviolent
como para que hubiera
masculinities.
llamadas
We
difusivas
made a
con
call,
nosotros
a
en
public
Colombia,
call.
era en un parque biblioteca.
We did a lot
Representaciones
of
no se
dissemination,
sienten
but people didn't
del
show up.
todo cercana a esos espacios. Dejo
People
por
do
ahí
not
para
feel
decirles, en
close
efecto,
to these
hay una
spaces.
estructura, puede ser que haga
There
falta
is
más,
an
pero esta ciudad tiene
infrastructure,
muy buenos
but
escenarios de
this city
encuentro.
have really
Creo
good
que
places
deben ser
for
apropiados por la
encounter,
comunidad, pero
but
también se
the
vale decir la
community
realidad.
need to own
Digamos
it.
que a veces ese edificio bonito, gris,
That
no
nice
es
gray building
necesariamente
is
lindo,
not what
o así como
might
se ha
not be
construido,
what
no es
people want, or
necesariamente
the
la
way that it
edificación
has
como
been built is not what people embrace as their own, and therefore they don't
utilizaron
use
por
it
primera
the
potencia.
way
Yo
they
lo que quiero decir
should.
para no ser muy extensa es el
And
tema,
lastly,
digamos, de las visiones del desarrollo para construir,
about development
digamos, los
issues
desarrollos de la paz. Hace unos años tuve la
from peace.
oportunidad en la gobernación de
Some
Antioquia
years ago, I had the
en el Secretariat de
opportunity
Paz de Medellín,
in
donde
the
definitivamente
in
hablar
an,
de paz, ¿cierto?
the
Cuando hablar de
governor's
acciones de
office
paz
of
en el
Antioquia
territorio es
to
hablar de
be
todas las líneas de
uh,
desarrollo.
to talk about
Paz
peace.
es tener buena salud,
For building
paz es
peace,
tener
we need
buenas
to talk
condiciones
about
de
all the
educación,
aspects
paz
of
es tener
development,
condiciones
education,
para tener
healthcare,
condiciones económicas dignas,
good
paz es
conditions
tener
for
escenarios
have
deportivos
a dignified
grandes, ¿cierto?
economic
Son todos aspectos
conditions.
del desarrollo.
These are
Ahora,
all
¿qué pasa? Los
development
5 acuerdos,
subjects.
digámoslo así,
The
que
5
hemos logrado
agreements
que este
of the peace agreements that this country has as a pathway, or that should have as a pathway, have three, three
deberían estar al centro de los debates y las discusiones. Uno, insisto, y como lo han dicho también los
three
compañeros,
cross-sectional aspects.
Medellín no está
First, the
desconectada de la
rurality.
lógica rural,
Medellin
desconectada de la
is not
lógica
linked
andina.
to the
Entonces,
rural
eso, por ejemplo, a la
logic,
gente, digamos,
and
se le
that for
sacude la
people in the
imaginación
urban areas,
de estas entidades o de estos actores que hemos
people
nombrado.
of these
Eso es
stakeholders we
una
have
conversación
mentioned,
muy desconectada de la realidad. Entonces yo creo que ahí nos hace
that is
falta comprender
conversation that is not
construir la
linked
paz
to
un
reality.
poco con lo que
We
han
need
dicho
to
los
understand
compañeros,
what does
que
it
han
mean
venido
to
del
build
municipio,
peace
que han venido de
with
las
the
diferentes
people that has come from the municipalities,
del
and
desplazamiento y lo que
because of the
significa también tener una
displacement,
ciudad que también tiene un
and
territorio
what it
rural.
means to have a
Debe ser
city that has a rural territory as well.
realmente, y en esa ciudad me parece que está
In
muy
this
poco
city,
discutida. Y soy
we have
reconocida también
discussed
de los
very
esfuerzos que se
little
han hecho, porque sé
about
que son
that,
esfuerzos,
and I
esfuerzos
recognize the
importantes.
efforts
Lo
that
otro es
have
la
been made.
participación. Se supone que el segundo acuerdo va en la
Second,
línea de esa
participation.
apertura
The
democrática.
second
Y esa
agreement,
apertura democrática implica eso,
that point
el
is
debate, la discusión, los
a
escenarios, la
democratic
participación, los
opening that
representantes
implies
de los
scenarios,
diferentes
participation,
actores y
representatives
demás.
of
Y yo
the
creo que
different
eso que cada vez está
stakeholders, and I
más
think
fragmentado, más disperso.
that
Y lo
is
segundo es que creo que alrededor
fragmented.
de esas construcciones, de esas propuestas de
And
paz,
secondly, around these
desde
peace
el
proposals,
desarrollo con esa mirada de paz, hay tres actores que son
there are
fundamentales en
three
esos acuerdos y que son
stakeholders
los
that are
sectores que
key,
más dificultades tienen para
and
levantar su
those
voz
are
y para
the
ganar espacio.
stakeholders that are have more
Son
difficult to be heard:
son
women,
los tres grupos
young
que
people, and
deben
victims. Those are the
unirse
three
trabajando
groups
en un escenario de
that
disidencia, en un
have
escenario de
difficulties
conversación,
to
en un escenario de debate
be
de que sea siempre más duro. Yo creo
represented
que
and to be
eso
heard.
pasa también en
We also
buscar
need
maneras
to
distintas de
think about
reconocer
different
las
ways
mujeres,
of
de los jóvenes y de
recognizing
las
the voice
víctimas
of
para
women,
poder tener conversaciones
young
que
people, and the
realmente
victims to
apunten
have
a una mirada del
conversations
desarrollo
that
con ese enfoque
really
de
look at
paz, de derechos
development
humanos,
with an
cómo
approach
se
to
busca con
peace and
esa
human rights that is
a
looked
las que
for
hoy
in these
llamamos sociedad,
constructions that we are called to as a
realmente
society, but that we are
necesitamos
not
para poder
seeing as what we need in order
materializar.
to
Dejaría por ahí y
materialize it.
cerrar porque sé que el tiempo es corto.
R- Unfortunately, we don't have time. We have had a very interesting space. We will try to compile the questions that weren't able to respond here for later. You conclude by thinking about the legitimacy of the institutions of the city in the territories. It is really difficult for people to own the agenda of peace if it's not taught for them. The break then is expressed, and it entails a challenge in terms of the legitimacy of the work in territories that have been neglected by the state and that have gone through very complex conflicts and that deserve to be heard. That's an aspect that we identified here, especially when the institutions com- need to recognize the needs in the territories. They don't have to invent solutions, but they need to start with those challenges in the territories to create public policies from there. So we are full of questions which are very valuable. I would like to thank you. For me, it was a pleasure to be listening to you, learning with you, and also listening to the reactions arising from this dialogue. Before ending, I would like to thank you for your generosity and your time, your words in this encounter. And I will give the floor to Eduardo, who will talk about the next session that we will have. Ana, Eduardo, the floor is yours. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this dialogue that has been really interesting. And I'm very thankful to the moderator and the organizers. Some questions have not been responded, but we would like to think that we can have, we could have the questions before the session. All of you who are participating, please be in touch with the information. I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I haven't spoken English, but we will let you know in advance to continue with this conversation. But now we would like to tell you about the next session, the next dialogue that will be held in September, on September 15th. It will be on a Wednesday at 10 a.m. and that will address the subject of the conference of the which is what is development ethics in times of conflict. That is a very wide topic, but we need to touch that topic as well. Eduardo, do you want to say anything? Thank you, Anna. Yes, we will have that event that will allow to discuss the fundamentals and scope of development ethics for countries such as ours that go through so many challenges in terms of transition to peace. And on the other hand, we will have the opportunity to listen to Professor David Crook, which has been a central figure about this topic in the world. And we will also have Professor Anna, and I will also join. We are very interested to have you in that session and to have the colleagues, Sonia, Yuri, and Juan Camilo, and Oscar, articulating these ideas that a bit theoretical and maybe not so linked to the realities and the communities, and to articulate that with the dynamics that the cities have. Thank you all so much. We will send the invitations. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank, thank you, Anana, for the invitation. And we look forward to be part of this dialogue that I believe it's worth it to continue, and that I believe gives us very important elements. I thank all the people that have made possible our dialogue. A warm regards to all the people who has been here and all those people who have been organizing this session, and the people that have joined the session this morning who leaves us with many questions. Warm regards, everyone, and I hope to see you next time.